Okay, let's get started. I think I'm going to take your advice. Let's get stuck in because I do want to add a lot of context and a lot of value to you, and for you coming to my session, I really do appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. So this session is all about Estonia's journey into building a digital society, and when it started, and what were some of the decisions, and what were some of the factors that made that decision, and some of the journeys along the way, along with some of the major events that you may have seen. And it's really getting into the lessons learned about what value you can get from unlocking digital identities in your society. Not just within a business, but within a society, and the value it provides to citizens as well. So this is going to be a whirlwind history lesson from Estonia. So let's get through it. So my name is Joseph Carson, and I'm the Chief Security Scientist. So I'm a security researcher and ethical hacker, and also advisory CISO at Delinea. Based in Estonia for the last 20 years, been in the industry for more than 30, and this is hopefully going to give you a bit of enlightenment and interesting. My first time speaking at Identities, so it's a pleasure to be here. It's my second session this week, so hopefully this will be a journey that will continue. So the first thing is I'm going to talk about blockchain. I don't actually think I've seen a blockchain session this week, so I will be talking about blockchain, but the one thing I want to make it clear is I'm going to be talking about the Estonia's implementation and use of blockchain, not the blockchain that we tend to always hear. And I'm not going to be talking about how blockchain is going to solve all the world's problems, and I'm going to not be talking about how it's going to solve all identity issues or security challenges. I will be specifically talking about the value that Estonian implementation provides to society. So that's what we'll be talking about. Now, when you hear about blockchain, and when I talk about it, a lot of people automatically go to the one thing in their mind, which is cryptocurrency. That's what we go to as the basis and the foundation of blockchain. And we hear about, the cryptocurrency in 2009, we hear about Bitcoin, and that's where we base blockchain from as a society and from media and from news. But in fact, who knows, does anyone in the room have an idea when actually blockchain really did start? Any years given? So, 1979. And the reason for blockchain, it was actually back in 1979, one of the biggest issues was it was around networking of computing. And if you wanted to move data from one computer or one server to another, there was a lot of noise and a lot of integrity failures. So back in 1979, Ralph Merkle came up with the Merkle tree. And the Merkle tree was the ability to make sure that as you move data from one location to another, you can do concatenation of hashes and then compare those hashes in the final destination to verify the integrity of the moving of that data. And this is really where you get into the first, let's say, technical implementation of a blockchain, was using the concatenation of hashes. And that this is really what the basis of a lot of blockchains built on, is concatenation of these hashes. Now, it even goes to, I'm always looking further. I'm always looking at, well, through my studies in education, I'm always looking at how does this look like in a real world, in a physical world? So I'm always looking, what does it look like in a physical world? And I get into, when I think about blockchain and the implementations, then I go to the Bible. The Bible is actually one of the early considerations of a physical world implementation of a blockchain. And I'm not saying that the data is accurate. That's not what I'm saying, and that's not what blockchain is about. It's about the actually integrity of the events that everyone agrees upon, and it gets widely distributed to the point where you can't change one of them, where basically everyone can verify against it. So this is where I look at, is looking at in a kind of real world scenario. So let's move into talking about how Estonia uses this and some of the things that they've done in the digital society. So the first thing is Tallinn, Estonia. This is where I live. This is not far from my home. It's an amazing place. If you ever get the chance, I do highly recommend going and visiting and just getting to experience the digital society that they have, because it is honestly amazing. So this is where the story and the journey begins. Tallinn, Estonia. Now, it's important to understand a little bit of context about Estonia. So this is kind of where some of the kind of information. So Estonia, you can see that it's not in the center of Europe. It's a little bit on the outskirts in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe. We have a border with Russia. We have the Baltic Sea between Estonia and Finland. And then south of Estonia is Latvia as part of the Baltic states. Now, to give you an understanding, it's about 45,000 square kilometers in distance. There's a population of about 1.3, 1.4 million. And it's actually a very diverse population. And the reason for the diverse population is over the years, it has actually been heavily invaded and occupied by other countries. And that's what's created that diverse population. So, of course, some of the key dates was in the independence in 1918, the occupation during 1940 to 1991 of the Soviet Union, and then re-independence in August 1991. And that was a significant date in that time of the independence. So as Estonia became independent in 1991, they really set off that they wanted to look at how they can form this new government. And the government was very young. It was a singing revolution. And they wanted to really understand about using all of the new things around them, how can they excel and move forward. Now, some of the challenges was that in 1991, of course, it was they wanted to become a paperless society. That was one of the things. It was also the start of the internet. We had the CERN, was kind of the early websites and digitalization. Now the challenge back in 1991 is this young government basically was established. The problem that in Estonia that they had was that if you've ever been occupied by a country for a long time, they change your history, they change your education, your language, your knowledge. So when you have an occupying country, they actually control a lot of what you know. They control the media. So, and this is ultimately what happens in an occupied country. And one of the things when Estonia became independent, the foundation that they wanted to make sure, as they were going down this path of a paperless society, they wanted to make sure that history could not be erased again in the future. That was the founding factor, was to make sure that history could not be modified and erased, even by themselves, the government. So they wanted to set that as their precedents going forward. Because one of the challenges in 1991 was that as the Estonia became independent, a lot of those who had fled the country back in the early, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, those who left started coming back because they could come back. And they started going to their family's land, and then all of a sudden they found this big massive manor on it, and they went through this big issue with land ownership and property ownership. So this was one of the kind of major challenges that they had. And any countries had occupied, this is a similar thing that you see over and over again as land is basically redistributed. So as they go down this paperless society, so they wanted to make sure that history could not be erased. So they got, and the great thing about Estonia was it was a center of knowledge for Russia, for Soviet Union. So you had a lot of amazing talent. You had mathematicians and computer scientists, and you had cryptographers. So they took all of these together and they said, right, go and find a way in a paperless society to make sure that history cannot be erased. So they said, go off. So they went into the woods. And my understanding, I know a few of the guys that actually did this. My understanding is they had a lot of vodka. They went and spent a lot of time in the sauna. And then many years later, in 1998, I always say that, was it the vodka ran out? Or, were you tired? Or, did somebody pull the wrong straw and had to go and ultimately present back? But in 1998, after that time away and doing the research, and actually the papers that they published in 1998 was already in the academic community in 1996, because as academics, they want to have proofing. They want to have other people look at the research. But ultimately, the paper was published in 1998 by a couple of the Estonian mathematicians and cryptographers. It was known as timestamping in linking binary systems. So it was all about making sure that you have legal documents that cannot be modified at a later stage. So, and some of the authors of that was Buldas and Letma and so forth. So they published this in 1998. And it was really the foundation, basically, of Estonia's implementation. And the purpose was for non-repudiation, that data cannot be modified by anybody at a later stage. So in order to achieve that, they realized that by doing this timestamping alone was not sufficient enough. So they needed to have, in March 1999, they established a government-issued identity. Because in order to have basically things of legal documents, you had to have an identity that gets associated to it. So they created this legal government-issued identity. And here you've got on the actually SIM card here is an X509 certificates too. One is for authentication, the other one's for authorization or signature. So you've got two certificates on it in order to be able to do the verification of the identity and then the signing of the actually, but the ID card itself wasn't enough. So they needed to have something else, which in March 2000 was when the country first established that digital signature became equal to a physical signature. Because in the digital world, you need to have something that was equivalent. If I sign something in paper, I also need to have something in a digital world that was equal to that. So the law was passed in 2000 that enabled this digital signature. And then if you combine that, their timestamping, which is their implementation of blockchain, with a digital identity, with a digital signature, and time, then ultimately they realize that it's no longer just about going down this paperless path, that they're actually starting to see that we have the ability to become a digital society, because we now have the ingredients, the foundation to be able to start digitalizing services. Now, I've heard a lot of times this week where we talk about digitalizing the driver's license and putting it into, let's say, a digital form. But you have to understand you have to go beyond that. You have to start thinking about, it's not digitalizing the identity of the card. What you're digitalizing is the actually attributes to provide digital services. So you're digitalizing the services that that card provides. And if you think about driver's license, it's about, are you legal to drive? Are you able to buy alcohol? Because who gets a driver's license in the US to have two main purposes, is to go buy alcohol and to basically shoot guns. So that's ultimately what they get driver's license for. It's not to drive a car. The car is the third part. It's alcohol is the first part. So you have to understand what you're doing is, it's the services that enables. And that's ultimately what Estonia realized back in 2002. So in 2002, they actually implemented what was then known as X-Road. And I still prefer using the older version of this rather than the new version, because the new version is a bit confusing and it's round and it's kind of hard to explain. But ultimately what they did is they started looking at those elements of the government services and how to deliver those services in a digital way. So some of the first systems, and this is really important, if you've ever gone down this path, one of the recommendations and the lessons I've learned is that when you ever do this and you're delivering service to a citizen, the first thing you always have to do is it's about providing value to the citizen first before you provide value to you. I see a lot of governments going down the path of trying to do this, and they focus on the value to themselves first, citizen afterwards. In order to get adoption, there has to be value for the citizen. And some of the early systems that they actually digitalized in these services was around things like tax returns. And that ultimately saved lots of time. Tax returns then, back in 2002, then would take 15 minutes. Opening up a business was 18 minutes. So you start seeing the time-saving element and the value to the citizen. It's about giving value to the citizen first, and then trust is built over time. But you want to get adoption, and you want to build that trust over time. So what you end up having here, if I explain kind of some of it, so the back end, you've got the private sector, and you've also got the public sector. And you've got these security servers, and this is where the concatenation of the hashes happen. So the security servers is where all the transactions, the digital signatures, the verifications, they all go through. And the data is decentralized. So the data, if your telephone number resides in the telco, your financial information only resides in the bank, your home address is only in the population register. So you've actually de-risked the actually data itself by actually having it separated and decentralized. So even if you do have a compromise, only one set of the data attributes is ever compromised, not all of them. And you don't have duplication across all of those. And the transactions here that happen through the security servers, they get into concatenation, and ultimately they get signed with a government certificate. But one of the things I mentioned earlier, and the reason why I talk about the Bible as part of this, is that in order for the government in Estonia to remove their ability from actually changing history, is that they actually take the root hash and they print it once a month in the Financial Times newspaper, so that they themselves, after that time, can never change history themselves. So it means that any citizen can go and self-audit the government and have transparency in the government's actions, and even after a month, the government cannot change history. So that's one of the key elements of building trust in these systems, is providing value to the actual citizen first, providing auditability, and providing a way from you to remove the ability to manipulate and change history yourself. So this is one of the key systems here. So everything was great. It was all hunky-dory. We were loving the system. The citizens were getting huge amounts of value from it. And ultimately, over years, we now have today more than, I think it's 4,000 digital services that is enabled through this by both government and private sector. Now, in the early 2000s, Estonia made a big decision because over the years, of course, since the independence in 1991, they still had a lot of close ties to Russia. But in the 2003, 2004, they made a big decision to decide that they wanted to focus more on the West than the East. And so in 2004, they became a member of NATO. And in 2004, May 1st, they became a member of the EU. And that was a kind of indication to Russia that, and at that time, the ties became a little bit political instability. And they were saying, we're now going to focus on the Nordics and West, and that's going to be the way forward. So these were major indications in the political side. Then in 2005, Estonia was the first country to introduce internet voting. And I'm not talking about electronic voting where you go and push a button on a machine. I'm talking about internet voting where you can vote from home. You can vote from anywhere, at any time, in any location. And this is significant because it becomes inclusive. It allows people that may not be able to go and vote in person. Maybe they're traveling, maybe they're sick, maybe they're in hospital, maybe they basically have disabilities, maybe they live far away from a voting booth and they can't get to it. This means that you're opening up the voting to a lot more people than traditional, or they work night jobs and they sleep during the day and the voting is only open at certain times. So this is really where you start inclusivity. And ultimately, over the years, this year was significant. In February this year, one of the votes was the first time that internet voting surpassed all other votes. So internet voting was the primary method of voting this year. And of course, a lot of things over the years, it also meant that over the pandemic and COVID, that the Estonians could also vote safely, where they didn't have to go stand in queues. They could still vote from any location. And also, the voting opens up 7 days before, which means you can also change your vote. If the politician says something stupid that you disagree with after you've already voted, then you can go and say, well, okay, I'm going to re-vote again. It also prevents collusion, people buying votes. It also prevents the media from basically, trying to poll outcomes as well. So having this was another major step in the actually digital service that they provided. Now, in April 27, 2007, a significant event happened. So what Estonia government at the time decided to do was, in the city center, there was a set of statues and graves. And it was always, every year, it's a bit controversial. It was always creating political unrest, especially around Victory Day in Russia. So when they have Victory Day, the Russian-speaking population in Estonia would celebrate, and they would go and celebrate this time. In April 27th, they decided to move these statues and move them to a graveyard outside of the city. So rather than having it from basically a central point in the center of the city, they decided to move it a little bit further out. And this created a bit unrest in the Russian-speaking population. When I always say Russian-speaking, it's important to have that distinguished, because they're not Russian citizens, they're Russian-speaking, which means that there is a big difference between basically their political and views. They speak Russian because that's their heritage, that's what they grew up speaking. It's not to say that because I speak English, I consider myself English or British. I'm not. I'm actually Irish. But it's the same concept. But at this time, there was a lot of protests within the Russian-speaking community in Estonia. And ultimately, there was violence in the streets. People were protesting. They were smashing window shops. They were burning cars. And the Estonian, basically, police and law enforcement came in and started to actually control the unrest. And ultimately, that created a bit of political instability between the Russian government saying, you're now creating basically suppression against the Russian-speaking citizens in Estonia. So there's a lot of kind of conflict between the Russian government and the Estonian government at that time. That resulted in a cyber war. A cyber war by itself, we tend to see more cyber wars that tends to be also having physical conflict, but this was actually only in a cyber context. There was no physical part of it. But ultimately, this happened in 2007. We end up seeing lots of websites, government websites targeted, the president, political parties, news organizations, banks, telecommunications. And everyone always looks at this event and they always say, see, Estonia, that's what you get for becoming very heavily dependent on digitalization, digital society. But at the time, for the citizens, it was very much, it was an inconvenience. Things were a bit slower, but you still do your daily stuff. You still access, the banking, you still do your work. But ultimately, then you get into websites were defaced, and then there's a major DDoS attack. And every day, the government would change the IP address routings and filters, and then if you were outside of Estonia, you may have not been able to access certain websites in Estonia. But if you were in Estonia, you could access all the services. So it was still functional. So ultimately what happened was, the biggest issue was not the cyber attack, and it was not the cyber war. This was not the concern. The concern is, if I go back to the whole visualization, is that Estonia has a land border with Russia. And when I go back to that implementation of X-Road and the digital services and the blockchain implementation for timestamping to make sure that history cannot be changed, had a big flaw. And we realized that flaw in 2007. Because ultimately in 2007, there was a military exercises on the border of Estonia. And we were concerned that there might be an invasion. They might cross that border, and like they've done multiple times in years, they might come across the border. And all of the Estonian data, the data itself is not decentralized, it's within the land border of Estonia. Citizens' population information, the tax records, all of that's contained within the border of Estonia. So ultimately you can see here that the whole idea of making sure that history cannot be erased had a major flaw, because you can simply come in, destroy the data centers, and that data, the core data that makes up those transactions, is gone. So this was a major issue. It was called the doomsday scenario. And this was something that we started looking at. How do we protect against this type of scenario? How do we innovate? And there was a big conflict between political parties and, we should go back to the old way, or we should, do different ways. There was a big kind of different debates over this. But ultimately, in August 2008, there was a major also significance, and this was the establishment of the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which is the NATO Cyber Defense Research Facility, which was then established in Estonia. And they also had the European Organization for Security also working together to determine what is the best way forward. How can Estonia make sure that if there ever was a land invasion, that history and all of the Estonian information could be preserved and unaffected? So one of the ideas we came up with, and my specialty at the time was DDoS prevention. So I recommended you need to be decentralized. And we went through the process of how can we make Estonia be decentralized? How can we actually make sure that if there ever was a land invasion, that the data was not in the country? So we looked at cloud services, and we looked at different options. We looked at moving it into other data centers in other countries. And the Supreme Court came up and said, no, you can't do that, because we need to make sure that the data is protected by the sovereign law of Estonia. And if you move it outside, we're then dependent on other countries' laws for that. So that became a big issue. So ultimately, the CIO of the government at the time, Tavi Kotka, we were working together, and I was going decentralized, decentralized. I kept pushing this decentralization. And he came up with the idea of ultimately using virtual data embassies. And this was the ability to then take the data outside of Estonia and put it in the embassy locations, which is still bound by the laws of Estonia. So they ultimately decided that 5 was the optimum number, because if you ever needed to do maintenance, you need to take 2 down, because we had a voting system of concatenation of hashes going back to the timestamping. You needed to have an odd number to have a majority vote, to make sure that the root hash was always basically majority voting. So ultimately, 5 embassy locations were decided, and ultimately this led to the data embassy concept led to what was then e-Estonia. This was then separating the dependency of the actually digital society from the physical land, that now, even if the Estonian country was ever demolished or had a natural disaster that wiped it off the face of the earth, Estonia could still continue in a digital society, because all that data is preserved. All that information, records of history is preserved outside of the borders of the country. So this was a major kind of move forward in innovation, and ultimately led to what was then known as e-residency. So Estonia realized that, okay, if we're moving outside of the borders of Estonia, why don't we extend that to other citizens? So all of you in the room, you can ultimately become e-citizens of Estonia, and then opt in and be able to benefit from the digital services that Estonia has been able to adopt and provide. This ultimately led to basically, we realized that the embassy locations were not ideal for basically putting data center-like services. There's a lot of limitations if you put it in an embassy. So ultimately, UK was actually the primary choice, but a little blocking issue came up with Brexit. So then Brexit became unpredictable what was going to be the result. So they ended up going with a second choice, which was actually having an official data embassy within a data center in Luxembourg. And this is another way of looking forward into making sure that the sovereign land and the ability to maintain that outside of Estonia, if there ever was a land invasion. Ultimately getting to the point where today, they have been able to make sure, and that emphasis, that foundation back in 1991 was to make sure that history cannot be erased. That still becomes the foundation, and the auditability and building trust and transparency is some of the key ingredients, ultimately getting to this data embassy location. So even other countries that might be in similar situations, that might be small or might be prone to natural disasters, looking at these as ideas in order to how to expand your country and have it as the basis, and the foundation of that is tied to the digital identity. The foundation is all tied to those elements. Ultimately, we're basically a few years ago, the president came out and said that we're no longer concerned about cyber attacks because of that decentralization. There's no single target to attack. There's no one place to take out. Even if you did a land invasion, the country can still prevail. And the next step was into artificial intelligence. So the Estonian government then started looking back in 2015 about how they can adopt AI. And I had a big discussion, maybe a heated discussion, I would say, about this in the government, that ultimately, the reason why we had the heated discussion was that the artificial, what was called was Krat. And Krat is a mythological creature in Estonia that is actually known to steal your memories when you're sleeping. And I was going, how is the government going to get away with having a law and a bot that's called CRAT that steals your memories when you're sleeping? So we had a big debate about the name. But ultimately in 2018, it became CRAT law. So CRAT law became the law. And ultimately, now what they've done is they've taken all of those digital services to like literally everything you can get from a digital service. So you can park your car, to getting public transportation, to your loyalty cards on your phone, it's all consolidated, to your prescriptions, your medical prescriptions, to the postal service. Everything has been digitalized, to import taxes, and it's impressive. I have never, in the last 7 to 8 years, I have never had the need to go visit the bank or a government office. In the last 7 or 8 years, I've never had to go. I had to go once, about 2016, to actually get a photograph taken for a verifiable photo to add to the identity. That's the last time I've ever visited a government office in Estonia. And ultimately, the measurement of that is to reduce wasted time, is to give time back to the citizens to do the thing they want to do. And when we look at that, the measurement of doing this has basically made Estonia, what they measure success of the system is ultimately how many days GDP per year are we reducing of wasted time of the citizens. And Estonia right now is between 5 and 6 days GDP saved per citizen per year. And that calculates into about 2.5 billion savings. Giving the citizens back to the things that they want to do. And that's where you get adoption, because the citizens basically see the value themselves. If you look at me, I have never had to visit in 7 or 8 years a government office to even stand in a queue to vote to do anything. That the value and the time I've saved from all of that has given me back a lot of things I can spend the time I want to be doing. Now, it's even going further. So a lot of things, when you go into even doing digitalization services, that sometimes you still have to fill in forms and you have to do things repeatable every year. If you have to do a driver's license application or insurance application, or you want to open up a business. Well, what the CRAT bot is, the CRAT bot is an automated version of me. And when you actually remember, as I mentioned, it's this little creature that steals your memories. But in fact, what it does, it remembers my choices. It remembers my selections. It remembers what I actually did, to the point where that if I've ever filled in a form, I don't need to do that again. I can just go to the CRAT and say, CRAT, do this for me. The only thing I have to do is verify that it's really me that's actually making the request. And then if there's a signature that needs to be done, I can go and sign it. Getting to the point where it's almost like every Estonian citizen now has hundreds of minions doing the work for them. And the only thing I need to be focusing on is verifying it and signing it. That's only what we want to get to, is the point where we want to make it simple. And that's why it's really important to look at how the foundation and the things that digital services can unlock. And that we shouldn't get focused on just digitalizing the card or digitalizing the identity. We should look at digitalizing the services. And identity is a key portion to that. And this is how Estonia is unlocking even artificial intelligence into the digital society. Ultimately getting to the point was, what can we learn from some of these things? Is that cyber war is here, will happen. There was going to be a lot of political unrest, there's going to be a lot of political instability. But transparency and cooperation is key. When you're transparent to the citizen and you allow the citizen to self-audit the government, that's what you build trust on. Trust is not basically just assumed and given. Trust is built. And if you allow the citizens to actually audit yourself, that's what you're able to establish. Decentralization is one of the key things. We had to be decentralized. We had to make sure there's no one point of failure. And that's where you end up getting scalability. You also get the ability to then expand those services to a much broader adoption and interoperability. Data embassies is also a key solution to make sure, and this is also part of GDPR as well, is to make sure that the law is tied to the data and it's not just tied to the location. So even getting further, we can actually look at basically the data embassy concept. And then digital identities and privileges is the foundation of all of this. Going back to 1991, when they set this path forward about making sure history cannot be erased, the key elements of that was identity, was the privileges, was the signature, was time, and making sure that history cannot be erased. Ultimately, I hope this has been educational. I think I might be a little bit over in time on my but if you do have questions, anyone have questions before we move to the next session?
Quick question. How do you deal with economical diversity in terms of getting everybody in Estonia afford to have computers and phones, and how the government helps that situation?
So if you go back to David's conversation about, does everyone need a $1,000 iPhone? No. You can use basically any of these services. You can simply, you can still use traditional methods. The traditional methods are still there and exist. But if you can have a simple phone, you can still access the digital services. The key part of it is it's tied to not the type of phone. What it's tied to is the SIM card. Actually, you can actually have an ID card, and then the SIM card on the phone, you can actually then sign those certificates that's on the SIM card to be extensions of the parent certificates as well. So now you can simply just use any phone in order to access the digital services of the government. So there's no, let's say, real big financial limitations that you're going to say that you need to have an expensive phone with an expensive app. And it's free for all citizens to use. For the government services, it's free. For some private services, like parking your car or using maybe some of the transportation services, there might be small transactional fees in those. But in majority for all citizens, the public services from the government is free to use. Any other questions?
Mine's a little more complex, so maybe I'll find you.
You can find me afterwards then. So, well, I hope this has been educational. I hope you get a bit of an insight into a history lesson in a short amount of time, and just getting at some of those ideas and some of the reasons and motivational factors and some of the decisions they made. It hasn't been all, like, nothing has been perfect the whole time. We've had, the cyber attack in 2007. We've had vulnerabilities in the card system that was used back in 2015. There's been these bumps along the road, but the key thing is how to find ways forward, how to actually keep moving forward and keep actually improving the systems. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for attending my session. And if you have questions, I'm